The following is rated NSFW. It contains strong language, spoilers, and adult situations, and may not be suitable for small children.
Order, please, order. Reels of Justice is now in session. The Honourable Judge Ben the Great presiding. Will you all rise for the Honourable Judge Ben the Great?
Be seated. Today we are hearing the case of the People versus Casino Royale, 1967. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with court proceedings, charges were brought against this film for being a quote-unquote bad movie. Now, the burden of proof lies upon the prosecution. What that means is if the jury were to render a verdict at this very moment, that verdict would have to be not guilty. Defense, it is your job to prove that it is not a bad movie beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt. Now, all of that said, prosecution, you may begin your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, mostly gentlemen, we are not here today to determine whether 1967's spy spoof Casino Royale is a bad movie. I think it goes without saying that it's a bad movie. It's an awful movie. It's a meandering, senseless, confusing slog of a terrible movie. This, I think, isn't even up for debate. Anyone who has seen this jumbled mess of a film can attest to this fact. No. Instead, we are here today to simply shed light upon why it's such a terrible movie. Because the truth of the matter is, the story behind the making of Casino Royale would make an even more interesting film than the film itself. Casino Royale is a masterclass of Murphy's Law in filmmaking. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. It went through a long, seemingly never-ending stream of rewrites by several individuals, being rewritten significantly even in the middle of production. It went through 6 different directors before it was finally completed. And worst of all, its leading man and protagonist left the production halfway through filming, forcing the filmmakers to improvise several new sequences with an entirely different star in a vain attempt to try to salvage the production. When I think of the absolute quagmire of a film that is Casino Royale, only one thing comes to mind, and it is these powerful words from the great Monty Python, to which I will now paraphrase. The directors hired to complete this film after the other people had been sacked wish it to be known that they have just been sacked. The film has been completed in an entirely different style at great expense and at the last minute. Show this wretched cacophony of a film no mercy, and give it exactly what it deserves here today. A guilty verdict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, prosecution. Defense, you may begin your opening arguments.
Gentlemen, and I use the term loosely, Casino Royale can be considered a bad movie. But what is the purpose of a film? The purpose of a film is to entertain. If it is entertaining, I posit that it is indeed a good movie. As the character in Gladiator said, "Are you not entertained?" And he was discussing people being dismembered. Is that a bad thing? Well, ostensibly, yes, murder is bad. But were they not entertained? The answer is yes, they were. Casino Royale, despite its upbringing, despite its methods of madness in its making, is in and of itself an entertaining film. In fact, at many points, hilarious and always interesting. Now, agreed, the making of the film is probably more interesting than the actual film itself, but that does not take away from the entertainment value of that picture or the laughs that are garnered from it and the fantastic elements that go to make up the crazy pastiche that it is. It follows a classic tradition of comical romps, starting with Hell's a Poppin' and movies such as Marx Brothers films and influenced later films such as the Zucker Brothers movies and obviously Austin Powers, which would never have existed without Casino Royale. So again, I say that it is a good movie, even though the making of it was terrible, and judging it by traditional linear storytelling, it is a mess. But at the end of the day, you are entertained. Thank you.
Thank you, defense. Very clear and succinct. Prosecution, you may bring forward your first point.
I think the first thing to talk about with this film is its overarching production issues. One of the overtly glaring issues with this film is its disjointed and fragmentary plot and structure. Now, this can largely be attributed to the fact that Peter Sellers, the original star of this picture, is apparently a total asshole. Seemingly, Sellers had tremendous issues working with Orson Welles, who was the antagonist of this film. And the feeling was more than mutual. Apparently, Welles referred to his co-star as that amateur. One of the credited sources for this ill will is that Princess Margaret came to visit the set one day. And after Sellers bolstered about being good friends with the princess, was promptly snubbed by her in lieu of Orson Welles. This provoked Sellers to walk off the set. Another story goes that Sellers was irate at Welles for insisting his character perform magic tricks during the film, which the director obliged. I find it very interesting that those magic tricks were not in the script or were not intended. Orson Welles decided to just show up and start doing magic. Apparently, many of the stars in this film were unaware going into it that it was going to be a spoof. They thought it was going to be a straight James Bond film. According to some biographers of Sellers, he may have been annoyed at this decision to make it a comedy. So he continuously rewrote and improvised his scenes to be more straight and less comical. Anyway, so the point is, Sellers, the performer, became very unhappy with the production and just started no-showing for days or weeks at a time, refusing to do his scenes with Orson Welles. Apparently, there's also a story that he ordered one of the sets to be torn down because his mother appeared to him in a dream the night before and told him she didn't like it. I don't know if that dream actually happened or if it was just an excuse he used. During the course of the film, Sellers apparently punched director Joseph McGrath, who was a personal friend of Sellers at the time. You can only imagine they weren't friends for long, after McGrath complained about Sellers' behavior on the set. So ultimately, we bring all this context and backstory up because Sellers ultimately left the production. His participation is abruptly cut short before all of his scenes were shot. This forced the filmmakers into a rather difficult position. They had to try to finish this film with the existing footage they had of Sellers, and thus they chose to pull in David Niven. And David Niven, if you don't know, was actually Ian Fleming's first choice for James Bond and Dr. No. And I could not even imagine that production with David Niven. It would be really interesting. So thus you get this really jarring final product where half of the film scenes were done with Peter Sellers and then the other half are done with David Niven, and they put on this flimsy framing device that Niven is the original James Bond and Sellers is someone pretending to be James Bond in the lieu of the gambling scenes. So it's just incredibly muddled and incoherent. It jumps around. It feels more like disconnected sketches or segments that are just piecemeal together to form something that seems to resemble a movie. By the way, this film ended up costing $12 million to make, which was twice its original budget. And it is also twice as much as Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger cost to make put together. In fact, it even outspent Thunderball and You Only Live Twice, which were made for about $9 million. So this incredibly disjointed plot jumps around over and over. It goes down these insane rabbit holes following these tertiary characters that are introduced briefly, have a segment or a scene, and then barely make any dent on the film later on. You've got, the character of Cooper, who's supposed to be the womanizing agent who is trained to stop being attracted to women, and he's used in one scene and he barely comes up again till the finale where he's just standing there. It introduces 4 different Bond girls, essentially. You've got Ursula Andress, and she's Vesper Lynn. You've also got James Bond's illegitimate daughter, Mata Hari Bond, and you've got Miss Moneypenny, of course, and then you've got another model called the Detainer. And all of these characters didn't need to be included. I mean, they could have done each other's job interchangeably. Any character there could have gotten, the Berlin scene or any of that. So that would be my first point, is that even the humor that does exist in there is so broken up by these incredibly jarring cut up segments that it's hard to enjoy the film. I agree there's some entertaining quality to it, in the same way that maybe watching a car wreck might be entertaining because you can't look away. But to say that the movie is, entertaining enough to lift it up from being bad, I mean, it can be bad and still entertaining, but it's still bad. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to my esteemed colleague to make any rebuttals.
What do you think of the film Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Is that a good movie? I ask you all, it is a good movie. It is disjointed. The fact that the production was plagued by issues has nothing to do with the actual value of the film as a film. So all that is true. In fact, in some ways, that might actually make a better case for why it is a good film, because it still is entertaining, despite the fact losing its main actor, having to rewrite and rejigger it so many times. But again, I come back to Monty Python and the concept and the genre of parody and romp movies. Again, going back to Hell's a Poppin', which was an adaptation of a play, were just sort of a lot of humorous, silly events based on, now I will say it was based on Olsen and Johnson, who were a comedy duo, much like Abbott and Costello and Laurel and Hardy. But the film itself is just a series of silly events that happen and a bunch of actually fourth wall breaking, which Casino Royale does have a bit of. In fact, that's part of the charm of it. It never takes itself too seriously. It dips in and out of, this is a serious Bond film. And the fact that some of the characters or some of the actors thought they were doing a serious Bond film, I think, until they got to the actual set and started realizing what they were playing up against. Again, it lends itself a certain wacky charm that I think is part of that genre. Again, Python films, and then going forward. Also, another thing that I love about the film, I think makes it a good film, it is a time capsule of 60s zeitgeist, particularly in comedy, following in the footsteps of Richard Lester's films with the Beatles, Help, and Hard Day's Night, and other films like Magic Christian, movies like again, a series of parody films that were very big in England called the Carry On films, which were always basically kind of a genre, not almost a genre, but a location. Either it was a hospital, or they did a send up of horror movies, Carrying On Screaming. They did send up of army films, and again, it was a group of players who kind of took on various roles, much like the characters in Casino Royale.
What was that Clark David 5 movie?
The Dave Clark 5 movie? I never saw that one. Oh,
okay.
I know what you're talking about. I never saw it, though, so I can't really bring it into my defense. But I think the genre of comedic romps do not rely on, again, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, doesn't rely on a linear plot that point by point you follow and things connect. It's more fun with the genre. And this was parodying the James Bond genre, which was huge at this point in the late 60s. They'd already done 3 or 4 films. Four. This film was released 2 months before You Only Live Twice, which is the 5th one. That's it. Okay, so it was 4. So it was a hugely successful franchise, much like the Star Wars films were in the 70s, and Spaceballs. If you think Spaceballs is a bad movie, it's the same thing. It's a parody of a genre without necessarily having a super linear plot. The other things that recommend it, I think, is a good film, is an incredible. It's more than a Muppet movie in terms of guest stars and guest appearances. I mean, from William Holden and Jean-Paul Belmondo, Ronnie Corbett, who went on to fame as a British comedian. George Raft, Ursula Andress. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, Peter Sellers, David Niven, John Huston is in it.
Mm-hmm. He also directs a few segments.
Yeah, with a terrible Scottish accent. But it's sort of, and it's almost like 4 movies in one, in a way, with the kind of the 4 major segments. The opening with Niven all the way through, where he then kind of gets Cooper, as you said. And then the Ursula Andress scenes with her as Vesper are completely bananas. But that's the completely banana part of it with the plot. And again, these guys, poor guys making the movie, were bending over backwards to make it somehow make sense. Is what makes it entertaining for me is that, and this could be inside baseball, as a filmmaker, particularly as a writer, you can pretty much tell where the movie's going to go, typically now with sort of the William, what's his name, the screenwriter guru. Everyone says, well, in the first 15 minutes, you got to set up your plot and your characters and all that. And then any screenwriter can kind of go, well, I can tell you what's going to happen because this character popped up or this prop was shown for more than a second. And then it's going to pay off here. This movie has none of that. You just are along for the ride. And again, maybe as a movie, it's definitely a cinephile's movie. Because of all the great character actors and cameos, and a lot of fourth wall nods to other films that these characters have done. George Raft basically plays George Raft, and completely thrown in again like a Muppet movie, which and the Muppet movie plot is very, very thin. It wasn't beset by production issues, but again, that kind of romp. I think it's a classic example. So, to sum up a little bit, classic example of a romp, particularly a time capsule of what was funny in British comedy at the time. The other thing that I think is a huge plus in its column is the soundtrack. Burt Bacharach's music is there's a number of things about it that are remarkable. First of all, among audiophiles, it's considered one of the best analog soundtrack recordings of all time. Mm-hmm. The song "Look of Love" became a hit. The music supports the comedy. So Bacharach was given this movie, as you know.
I believe "Look of Love" hit number 4 on the chart, and was nominated for a Best Song Oscar.
Yeah, exactly. So it has all these great elements to it, which is sort of like this again. The parody genre and the romp don't necessarily rely on clever plot, more on clever scenes and fun moments. The movie is definitely a mulligan stew of scenes and moments and gags that aren't necessarily related to pay off later. But the same thing can be said of the Austin Powers movies. The other thing this film did, besides influence Austin Powers and other comedic romp genres, again, like the Zucker brothers, but Laugh-In came out about 7-8 months later. And I think a lot of the guest stars from this movie were in Laugh-In, and probably because they were famous at the time, Orson Welles, William Holden, people like that. But that sort of non-linear silliness, I think, defined, despite the fact that it wasn't intentional, I think it's saved by that fact that it does kind of, or not even kind of, it definitely creates a vibe of 60s, anything can happen, but within the James Bond over, if you will. It's all Bond related. So those are some of the things that I think really bring it to that make it a good movie, even though it was badly made. But you can't hold that against it. It's just incredibly entertaining with a lot of memorable moments, which I would say there's other comedies that I've seen that were, well made and didn't suffer as many issues as this did, that don't have the memorable. I mean, look at something like, I don't know, just films of the era, like Breakfast at Tiffany's. A couple scenes. I mean, Mickey Rooney basically is the most memorable thing because it's incredibly offensive. But this film has songs and moments and gags that stick with you for the rest of your life, mainly because it's so bananas. So the fact that it isn't particularly linear and kind of goes all over the place, I think is the strong argument for why it is a good, entertaining film. I wouldn't use it in film school as the way to make a movie, but the fact that they pulled it out of the fire and turned it into something, again, maybe not intentionally at the beginning, but it was done as a comedy, a parody comedy. And the fact that their main star left halfway through production and was a complete a-hole, you can't hold that against it. And the fact that they pulled it out, I think, is really in its favor.
All right, prosecution. New points were brought up in the defense. Mm-hmm. Would you like to rebut those?
I think they were some interesting points, especially about trying to talk about the 4-story structure. But in comparison to Monty Python, Monty Python was intended to be on an ensemble cast, whereas this was a film that was forced to become an ensemble cast because it couldn't keep its star.
The James Bond films almost always focus on James Bond, the one spy going through. You very rarely leave Bond for anything more than maybe just a little bit of backstory on some other character. So if we're looking to parody that genre, I think such a vast departure from its format and structure, especially that wasn't intentional, is not enough to save it for me in my eyes. Like I said, Monty Python, it was an intentional choice to make it an ensemble piece, and it's a Monty Python is a sketch troupe making a movie, so I expect their film to be sort of a sketch kind of thing, whereas this is not Gilliam and Jones directing. This is 6 different directors ended up having their hands in this. You've got
but that has nothing. The fact the way the movie is made has nothing to do. The fact that it's an ensemble film, you have to take on its own merits, not the fact that it wasn't intended to be an ensemble film.
Well, I think you've got such bizarre shifts in style, though. Ken Hughes did all the Berlin scenes, so there's this weird German expressionist style the whole time. They make those allusions to Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's got skewed staircases and bizarre shadows, and then you cut to the final fight scene, which was done by the stunt coordinator Richard Talmadge, and he basically makes it a parody of Hollywood fight scenes. It's got the cavalry coming in, Keystone Cops, some SEALs. I do like the SEALs, not Navy SEALs, but actual SEAls.
And American Indians parachuting in.
Yeah, screaming Geronimo. I mean, there's jokes that hit to me. One thing I'd like to talk about here is the trail of bodies this film has left behind. The lives it has taken. Now, Fleming wrote this story in 1953, and the rights to the film rights were bought by Gregory Radoff in 1955. He paid $6,000. He tried to get financial backers for the film, but he wasn't able to before his death in 1960. So that's arguably, there's the first life that this film took. Gregory Radoff, then producer, perished in trying to make this film. Now, now the rights end up going to Charles K. Feldman, who's his agent, and he works with Howard Hawks, who wants to do a straight adaptation with Cary Grant as Bond. Unfortunately, things don't come together, and the Eon Productions ends up beating them and releasing Dr. No in 1962 and beating them out, and that's why they decide to go in the direction of the spoof to try to sort of avoid that competition. Now, the first person who takes a crack at this script is Ben Hesh, and he wrote Scarface, Spellbound, Notorious. He's very accomplished, and now he wrote initially about 4 drafts, and then he suffers a heart attack in 1964, 2 days before after finishing this script, and before he can present it. So there's body number 2. The next guy falls. We got a screenwriter who is down and perished and lives no more. That's the second life that this film has claimed.
Your Honor, I object. This is all about behind the scenes. It has nothing to do with the film. It's all about the making of the film. Now, that's not what I was told I'm defending. I'm not defending the filmmakers. I'm not defending the death count of the movie. I'm defending the film on its own merits.
The objection is sustained. We are not evaluating if a film is cursed or not. We are determining whether it is good or bad just based on the viewership of the film.
Okay, but just to build my case a little bit more on it being cursed, the stress of the film also ended up killing Charles K. Feldman. He ended up developing heart problems and then ultimately killed him a year later. And then finally, does anyone here know what this film is known as in Guatemala?
No.
In Guatemala, this film is known as the movie of the night before the earthquake because it aired for the first time in Guatemala on February 3rd, 1976, hours before an earthquake struck the country, killing 23,000 people, injuring another 76,000, and leaving thousands homeless. And apparently those who were in attendance for the earthquake at the time said that the earthquake was just the second worst thing to strike Guatemala that night. So...
that is amusing, Counselor, but the jury is instructed to deny that piece of evidence in their deliberations. You may continue.
But just the record show, I believe the film is cursed. Anyway, so besides these jarring plot inconsistencies that we've talked about, I feel like it fails a bit as a spoof, especially more so in hindsight. The tone of it is dry, but the Bond series and franchise become such a spoof of itself in later years that almost nothing done in this film is more ridiculous than anything Roger Moore did. There's flying cars, they fight a giant anaconda with a pen. So to say that I don't feel like this film goes far enough in its parody. I mean, in The World Is Not Enough, Desmond Llewellyn as Q is actually developing a bagpipe gun that also doubles as a flamethrower. So they actually use the bagpipe gun, maybe inspired from this film. Almost the entire Q sequence feels like a legitimate Q sequence in any Bond film, almost straight. That might have been one of Peter Sellers' touches, where he was trying to pull it a little bit straighter. I mean, as a hat that doubles as a gun, more ridiculous than Oddjob's chakram hat that we see in Goldfinger. I don't think so. I think that Bond is a sort of stammering, stuttering recluse who lives in the countryside with hundreds of lions. It didn't quite make me laugh. I mean, Orson Welles to me is very entertaining. He's only in 10 minutes of the movie. I liked Woody Allen, although, again, he's very limited in the movie. He's only about 20 minutes of the film. So a lot of the time I feel like I'm just following around these tertiary side characters that, to me, weren't that funny. I didn't think the Mata Hari daughter angle was that entertaining. She was an aesthetically pleasing person. But following her for 20 minutes into Berlin felt like a long waste of time. And that's one of the things about this film, too. It's long. It's got a runtime of 131 minutes. It's over 2 hours. And what's baffling to me is if you're having these production issues, right, and you're having a hard time with not having enough footage of Peter Sellers, why pad the film out almost an extra hour with all this worthless material? I mean, you could cut out the entire McTerry Scottish castle sequence and you'd lose nothing. All it establishes that Smersh is out to kill Bond, which is arguably established just as easily with the milk truck scene that happens right after it. Why introduce Mata Bond at all, as I said, and send her to Berlin? You could have sent Moneypenny to do that. Ursula Andress could have done it. Or just as easily, since all it established is that Le Chiffre is desperate for money, you could have just had one of the MI5 guys go, Le Chiffre is desperate for money, and now it's done. You don't need to drag it out into this 15-minute scene that leaves behind not only, again, Sellers, who was out of the film, but it also leaves behind Niven. So it's these little trips down the rabbit hole that never seem to go anywhere or really be that funny, and add to a 2 hour plus runtime on a comedy, seem to really just stretch it out. It felt like padding. I mean, the second time I watched this film, I forgot entirely about the Scottish castle thing in the beginning. I was like, oh yeah. And it's a half hour of the movie. That's just how long it is, that by the time you get to the end of it, you barely remember it. So I think there were ways to shave probably close to an hour, a little less, off of this movie, and it would have made it feel less disjointed, less choppy, and ultimately, to me, a little less torturous. I can understand the difficulties of losing your leading man halfway through filming, but it seems like the filmmakers took the longest possible road they could to get around that.
All right, question to the defense. Is it too much of a good thing?
I think the non-linear, the padding as well, the fact that there's so much to it, again, speaks to the fact that you don't know where the film is going. I mean, if overlong movies are bad, then everything Peter Jackson has made since The Frighteners is bad.
But I'd object. I think Peter Jackson uses his time well.
Oh my God. Let's not get into this, but King Kong and the Hobbit movies, you could cut 40 minutes out of any of them, pretty much any 40 minutes, and you'd have a better film. So I don't think
agree with that.
Overlong makes it bad, or inherently bad. It might be bad decisions. But again, the things that I think that you're bringing up as negatives, to me, you don't know where the film is going, which I always enjoy as a filmmaker or as an audience member. If curses and things like that and bad production were issues, then Back to the Future would be a bad film because they fired the star 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the movie was already shot. That doesn't make it a bad movie. It's really immaterial to what the film is. So judging it by its own merits, I bring up
what natural disaster did Back to the Future cause?
Was it the Northridge earthquake?
That's immaterial to the point and should be stricken from the deliberations.
The defense's point is well taken, though. The Back to the Future did have a troubled production, and it is well known to be a good movie, so that can't be held against.
But no earthquakes. That's my point.
So again, it comes down to a genre parody. Now, all the different Bonds to me is what made it clever. They didn't just stick with one James Bond. In fact, the plot became there's going to every agent in what was not Scotland Yard, but every agent
MI5. It's MI5 in this
MI5,
one.
Yes, is going to be named James Bond, which is a clever to me. Some of the solutions to the problem of losing their guest star. And some of them were inherent in the plot, but some of them they twisted around and said, okay, now everybody's James Bond.
Yeah, Ben Hession, his initial script had the idea of doing the multiple Bonds. It's
Right.
the only element he wrote that remained in the final bit.
So again, that makes it, to me, more entertaining. It's not, again, the genre of romps, which I keep bringing up, and going back to Hell's a Poppin' and Monty Python. Also, moving forward, if you look at the movie that Val Kilmer did, hold on, I can't remember the title of it.
The Island of Dr. Moreau.
No, yes, exactly. No,
Top Secret.
Top Secret. Top Secret is a complete parody of spy movies, not Bond films, but World War II spy movies, and it's just a series of gags and moments making fun of those kinds of films, and I think that's what, to me, Casino Royale was. I grew up loving the Bond movies. The first movie I remember seeing was Goldfinger as a kid. So when Casino Royale came out, I enjoyed it as a kid and I enjoy it as an adult for, again, instead of focusing on the production issues and how it's not super linear, to me, that's what makes it a standout film. It's messy and sloppy, but it's always funny and it's always entertaining. The production value, as you said, they spent $12 million on it. It looks amazing, huge. And they blow up that entire, in the beginning, when they blow up David Niven, Bond Sr.'s house, I don't even know if it's a miniature. It was a giant set. It looked incredible. And it's like 2 shots and they blew the whole thing up. So the production value is great. Again, the music soundtrack is great. The 130 actors in it, many of them guest stars or people who went on to have careers or had huge careers. It's just fun as a cinephile to see them playing around. Again, George Raft and William Holden doing a comedy they didn't often do. Orson Welles basically getting to be Orson Welles as the Schiff, and then Woody Allen, as you mentioned, is Jimmy Bond. That's a hilarious idea. And he did it in a very Woody Allen way.
I do really like Allen's first scene where he's in the firing squad and climbs over the wall and goes into another firing squad.
Well, it reminds me of Bananas, when he's doing was it Bananas? No.
Yeah, it's Bananas.
Yeah, it's Bananas. But yeah, he's just very Woody Allen, which is, to me, a funny idea that Bond's nephew is Woody Allen and that kind of character with the ridiculous atomic bomb pills that he swallows. Again, all that made it entertaining, and just the craziness and non-linearity of it. I think if they had made the movie that it was originally intended to be, it wouldn't have been as memorable or be as funny. I think the humor to me is in just the messiness of it, how it's all over the place. Again, like the Muppet movie, like Top Secret, like so many of the Zucker Brother movies, or even later the Scary Movie films, which they're parodying a genre. They just do a pastiche of every gag and every horror movie you can put together. They're not bad films. You don't judge them as like, is this a good, solid, linear story? No, you judge it as, did I laugh a lot? Was I entertained? Did it ultimately deliver on the promise of, I'm going to laugh and have fun? And I think, in conclusion, that's what this film does. You if you've seen a Bond film, or if you've seen a number of Bond films, you get to see people having fun with that genre and those characters and blowing it out, deconstructing Bond, really. And the fact that your point that the later Bond films become parodies, to me, then this is the grandfather of all Bond films made after 1970.
And it's clear Austin Powers takes a lot of inspiration from this because of, Burt Bacharach showing up. And they also have the rotating bed in Austin Powers.
And Mike Myers says,
whose team are you on, Counselor?
I'm just bringing up points.
If Austin Powers wouldn't.
That doesn't excuse an earthquake, Ben. That's all I'm saying.
Order.
At the end of the day, it is not a bad film. It might have been made badly, but it is not a bad movie. It makes you laugh. You never know where it's turning, and there's great cameos and fantastic music.
One final point to the prosecution before we move on to closing statements. This is the film that inspired Woody Allen to direct his own films. So if that's not a point on my category, I don't know what is.
Did he not also want his name stricken as a writer from this film?
He did indeed, yes. A lot of people did.
He didn't actually write on it, though. He just wrote some of his own gags that he ad-libbed. But he wanted to make sure they didn't use that as a marketing tool because he was starting to be very successful as a comedian.
Yeah, he did. He also, since he was cooped up in his London hotel during production delays, he wrote the script for Take the Money and Run.
Yeah, which is a great
So
film.
again, I'm saying if it wasn't for this movie, Woody Allen wouldn't have made his own movies.
Exactly.
And who knows if he would have been able to adopt a daughter, and who knows where we would be in the world now.
Mike Myers would only have done Wayne's World.
Yeah, and that's it.
Yeah.
Yo, can I live in this alternate universe?
Defense, do you have any points that you would like to bring up as that you didn't go over yet?
I think I've pretty much, let me see my notes here. No, I think it's a cinephile's delight. If you love Bond movies, you're going to love it. If you like great music, you're going to love it. If you like seeing actors of those eras doing characters they don't normally do or making fun of characters they traditionally play, you're going to love it. And again, the score, besides the music, the songs, I didn't bring up, the score was like the score that Bacharach did is actually funny. He uses it in a way that Carl Stalling would use musical scores to point up a joke or put a fine point or a cherry on top of a gag, including the bringing up What's New Pussycat with Sellers, and there's a few other homage to classic movie themes that he peppers.
No, I didn't understand that scene though, because she opens the sewer cap and What's New Pussycat comes out of it. So I don't know if they're putting down What's New Pussycat and insulting it or what.
Well, the fact that you didn't understand it doesn't make it a bad movie or a bad gag. I think it's just
I did understand it. I mean, I knew they were making a reference.
Right, exactly. That's what I mean. It's just a recognition of what Sellers had done, and the fourth wall breaking, I think, is all part of it. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Very well. Prosecution, please proceed with your closing arguments.
Your Honor, esteemed members of the jury, I think there can be no question as to the guilt of 1967's Casino Royale. Granted, I understand the troubles raised in the course of production when you have a difficult star, but it seems to me that there were ways of getting around those issues without padding the film out to over 2 hours or introducing tertiary side characters and plots that never go anywhere. There are over 4 different Bond girls featured in this film, between Vesper Lynn, Miss Moneypenny, Mata Bond, and the Tainer, and they're all virtually interchangeable in terms of their relation to the plot. Any one of them could have gone to Berlin. Any one of them could have been kidnapped by Le Chiffre. Any one of them could have been held prisoner by Dr. Noah and slipped him the timed explosive capsule. Production issues are simply no excuse for the terrible choices that were made when there were other ways around those problems. It's no wonder that this film was not screened for critics prior to its release, which was very unusual for its time, because the filmmakers knew exactly what you and I know. And it's that they succeeded in making one stinker of a lousy, terrible movie. So when it comes to step in the juror's room and deliberate, render the only sensible verdict you can. Vote guilty. Thank you.
And defense, your closing arguments, please.
To say this film is guilty of anything except sloppy production is, in my mind, criminal. It is, in and of itself, funny. Comedy is very, very personal. Not every comedy, many people don't find Monty Python films at all funny. So the fact that some people don't find it funny, but others, such as myself, find it hilarious, is not something to judge a comedy by. If anyone finds it funny, then it's successful. It is proven over time to be a successful film, in that even as an example of how not to make a movie, it still is successful as an entertainment. And I think because parody doesn't have to follow the same rules as a traditional movie in terms of a linear plot with setup and payoff, I think it delivers in spades a parody of not only the Bond genre, but British film comedies and comedies of that era. And I think as a time capsule, it even gets better with age, because it shows what people thought was funny and who people thought were famous. and or what people were famous and what they were famous for in their little cameos. The fact that it meanders again only makes it more interesting as opposed to predictable. I think one of the things most movies can be guilty of these days is they're so predictable. In fact, 9 times out of 10, critics' biggest complaints are, well, you know what's going to happen if you watch the first 20 minutes. You know what's going to, you know how it's going to end. Even a film like The Sixth Sense with the big reveal in it, if you guess that in the first 20 minutes, then you just sort of watch it play out. This movie, you do not just watch play out. You have no idea what's going to happen, and the fact that it is excessive in its detours down weird little paths again is what makes it charming and original and unusual and ultimately memorable. And if anything is to be used to judge whether a film is good or not, it is, to me, is if it's memorable. If you see it and you go, that was nice, and you don't think about it ever again, then to me it might have been well done, but is it good? Debatable. This film, anyone who's seen it will remember it. Now, will they remember the plot? Probably not. But they will remember moments. They will remember characters that came in and out. I think that, in the end, is what makes it a good film.
All right. Thank you, counselors. Very succinct and passionate. Mr. Rodriguez, I believe you were appointed to lead juror. If you may take the jurors to the deliberation room and render a verdict.
All right. Dylan, you want to go first?
Well, I gotta say, they both made very compelling arguments here. I took some notes. The prosecution really focused on the bad production values, Sellers being, a poor actor in this, both literally and figuratively. And then, so the defense, though, but is it still entertaining, right? That's really the question he kept going back to, and I really thought that he brought up some good points. He was comparing it to Monty Python favorably. He was looking backwards and forwards at these romp and parody movies that came out, and the soundtrack is just an absolute banger. He is not wrong there. But going back to what the prosecution said, the movie's long. It's disjointed, and it feels like you're really just waiting for the next funny thing to happen. You don't know where it's going because it's not going anywhere. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one for me. But right now, I'm leaning towards guilty.
All right, and Ben.
I kind of agree with him. When I first went through this movie, I was very confused about the disjointedness into it. I went in it completely blind. I didn't know about any of the troubled production values or any of that. So there were like these scenes where it's just like these different set pieces and not all of them connected at all. And some of them were bad and would just get dumber and dumber. And then, okay, this one's all right. And then dumber. And they never had a complete thread. I was actually really seething angry when the Native Americans and cowboys and all that like come storming into it, because it just made zero sense at all. It did not connect to anything. It felt like a high school play where they're just like, how do we end this? I don't know. They all die and go to heaven. Yeah, that's it. Because that was completely set up.
Before this, because that was just like the end of Blazing Saddles, pretty much. Which one came first?
That was the note that I put down. This is the end of Blazing Saddles.
Yeah.
Literally, where everything goes to shit in Blazing Saddles, that is basically the last 15 minutes of this movie.
And was Blazing Saddles first?
This is 7 years before Blazing.
So this is predated that. So that would, you can't take Blazing Saddles into account then. But to the defense's point, I didn't think about this when I was watching the movie, and I was sort of agreeing with the prosecution, is I was never bored through this film at all, ever. I was never, ever bored. I was angry at times. Sometimes I was delighted with the soundtrack. Never bored. And that is a very strong point in its favor.
You were never bored in the 2 hours and 12 minutes.
I wasn't, ever. No. I was always like confused, maybe. Like confusion isn't boredom,
Yeah, but does that make it good, though?
No, I'm not saying it does, but that is a definite point to its favor, where it's not like I was ever just like sitting there like, okay, let's just end it. Because I was kind of like, where is this all going? I have no idea what the formula is in this, and it turns out there wasn't one, but still.
I think my biggest issue with it is, 10 minutes in, I was ready to convict it with an utter passion. Just please end my suffering. Let this please be over. I think I put down in my notes, how did Blake Edwards not direct this like 3 or 4 times? Just this loud cacophony of just noise. And so I was going into this ready to convict it, and then the defense brought up Hellzapoppin'. Now, Hellzapoppin' is a masterpiece. I think maybe 8 people have heard of it, and 3 of those people are Joe Dante under assumed names. But it is the perfect kind of defense, because that is a movie that is utter nonsense, makes absolutely no sense, but to a different point, it's not supposed to. It's literally supposed to be just a random succession of gags, whereas Casino Royale is accidentally that. Because they set out originally to make an adaptation, and eventually it just all fell apart. So, great defense, great point, but I don't know. I don't know if I can ever let this thing off the hook.
I'm inclined to agree with the defense, though, that we can't hold like the behind-the-scenes things against the movie. I think if you just take what's presented on the screen, you know,
well,
it's
you can, and that helps it make sense. I mean, yeah, I agree.
Well, I guess it helps you understand it.
And then you're like, oh, okay, Peter Sellers dropped out. I had no idea that was the case.
If you take it on its own, though, like I like what the defense was saying about, you know, like about the soundtrack, about it being a time capsule, and you know, and again, what it was going to establish moving forward here. But it's just like it's like going into like a really good steakhouse and ordering the fish.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna say guilty with the caveat of I really love Herb Alpert and that song.
I will also agree with a guilty verdict, but with the caveat that I think it should be sort of studied as to why it's bad. I think that it's a noteworthy film. It's not bad in the way that like no one should ever see this thing ever. It's bad in the way of being very noteworthy in the succession, especially in the James Bond films. It's sort of like a badge of honor you could sew on your uniform as to saying, hey, I've seen Casino Royale and I understand it.
Yeah, it's like the Vietnam War. Like, you need to understand it happened. We can't deny that it happened. And as a social document, it is fascinating. But in a court case, oh, guilty. All the way. Absolutely guilty.
All right, then. Let's, Mr. Foreman, I guess you could present our verdict to the awaiting judge.
All right, it looks like the jurors have finished their deliberating. Mr. Rodriguez, what is the verdict?
Your Honor, after 13,000 hours of deliberations, it is with a heavy heart that I declare this jury has unanimously decided to convict Casino Royale 1967 guilty as charged.
Yes, justice!
This is an outrage! I am shocked at the narrow-mindedness of this jury. I declare
order. You are in contempt, sir.
Justice for those 23,000 souls lost in the earthquake of 1976. Thank you.
This movie for 20 years to life for each of the lives that it has caused in the time that it cursed people in its release. Court is adjourned.
Justice was not served this day.
Mr. Thatcher, your thoughts on how this worked out?
I am deeply disappointed. I do believe that justice was not served today. She may be blind, but today she was dealt a deadly blow. This film will stand the test of time long after these jury and prosecution have laid in the ground, and people will bring it up as an example of comedy and parody and entertainment beyond that of a standard, blandardized studio production. I'm deeply disappointed.
Yes, I see. And Mr. Maynard, you had an overwhelming victory today,
yes.
And how would you categorize it?
Well, I thought it was a close one. I think that the defense made a lot of very strong points, and I think one of those strong points is just because a film is bad doesn't mean it's not watchable. It doesn't mean it's not likable, and it doesn't mean it's not enjoyable. I could say that I probably will watch Casino Royale again. Not anytime soon. I need a little break from it. I may have to wash my palate off with some like Dr. No or From Russia with Love. But I think I would watch it again as a curio. And that's what I think it is a curio. Unfortunately, just because the movie's entertaining doesn't make it good. And what we were charged here today is deciding whether the film was bad. And due to production issues, they produced a bad film. Watchable, entertainable, a historical curio for sure. But I agree with the verdict that was rendered. Guilty of being a bad movie.
Fair yet balanced. Thank you, Mr. Thatcher. Thank you, Mr. Maynard, for your valiant deliberations. We'll see you next time on the Reels of Justice.
All right, that was great. Great first episode on our sort of rebirth as the Reels of Justice. And I thought it was a heck of a film to have to slog through. I don't know what you guys felt. Obviously, you didn't enjoy it either. It was a heck of a trip.
You gotta say.
It's like Plan 9. Oh, I was going to say it's like Plan 9. It's enjoyable despite because it's bad. But then the question really is, it gets down to semantics. What is bad? What is a bad movie? To me, a bad movie is a boring movie. I've seen movies that were considered. I thought a couple of Fincher's movies were dull as dishwater. They're really well made, but I don't think they were good. And I'm not picking on David Fincher. The first thing that came to mind was Gone Girl. I was like, oh, it just didn't care, and it was over. And I'm like, fine. It was a well-made movie. It made sense. But to me, again, I come back to, is it entertaining? Is it something you remember long past the viewing? So I guess the question ultimately is, it's down to what is a good movie. And so my definition.
Mm-hmm. Or what is a bad movie? And I think that is, unfortunately, what we're here to explore.
Yeah. And Kirk, right? I gotta say,
sit down, folks.
You definitely pulled me closer to the good camp than when I started. I'm not.
I know, yeah. When I was watching it, I was like, "This thing, there's no way." And this guy picked it. How in the world is he going to defend it?
I came in confident, and his arguments did have me shaking in my boots a few times. I think the earthquake really pushed it over, though.
We ignored that as we were told.
Yeah, it's, and I also, as I said, it's a cinephiles movie because. If you're just a casual viewer, I think most people would probably agree, like, boy, what a mess. But if you like Bond movies and you like movies in general, again, I mean, Hellzapoppin' is one of my favorite. As someone who works with the Muppets, to me, Hellzapoppin' is something I bring up all the time. It's like, you don't need a linear plot with a romance in it to make a decent movie or even entertaining, fun movie. And that's kind of, where Hollywood's gone. Is they're so formulaic. And again, I like Marvel movies and I used to like Star Wars movies, but you kind of know, okay, this is what's going to happen. There's no surprises. So for me, again, it's bloated and long, but I still enjoy watching it for the same reason I think you mentioned. You forget entire segments of it.
Yeah. And Kirk, I definitely agree with what you're saying about movies today. Do you think with the other filmmakers and people in the industry that would they agree with you on Casino Royale, you think? Like if you went to your buddies?
I don't know. I know, like somebody, I think it was Robb said, it's a curio. I kind of treasure it because it's unique unto itself. Because of, again, the production issues, but just what they made given what they had. It's not the first movie to be plagued by problems. It's probably one of the, if not the poster child for what can happen, Murphy's Law, what can happen and go wrong. I think it was plagued by everything, not only the star walking out, but deaths and writers, quitting and people just, Peter Sellers punched one of the directors at one point. It was so plagued. I don't think there's been any other movie as plagued by problems and drama than this. And so the fact that it came out what it was a product of that, but I still think it holds up as, like you said, a curious. So I think you have to be a cinephile, which I am. So I can't get out of that brain and just be a guy who watches movies for fun and watch this and go, what the hell is that? But I thought that over most of the Hobbit films too. And I like Peter Jackson movies, but man, to talk about walks down paths that don't end up anywhere. You're just like, all right, that was. And to me, they're more forgettable than Casino Royale. And maybe in 30 years, people will watch the extended director's cut of The Hobbit and go, wasn't that great?
Coming soon at a Reels of Justice near you.
Well, that's another thing, too. Like, you look at how it was received when it was contemporary, and then how is it going to be received years later? And there's probably are movies like that we would all agree, like, that's not good. And, then our grandkids are going to be having their own 3D virtual reality podcast where everyone's sitting in a room and talking
Baby
about, like,
Boss is the best movie of the 2000s ever.
It's like, can we talk about Justin for Kids?
Wait, Dylan loves Baby Boss.
I do love Baby Boss, actually. I think
Or is it
that's
Boss
a good-
Baby?
Or is it Boss Baby?
Well,
I
Baby,
liked Boss
whatever.
Baby. That's something we could get into differently, because I'm actually not a cinephile, so I'm confused as to why I'm actually on the podcast, to be honest.
To backtrack a bit, I think the only movie that has ever been more disastrous than this has been Terry Gilliam's Don Quixote,
Yeah.
and the version that ended up being made was not even the movie that he started making. So the fact that this exists is a fascinating case study.
To me, I was thinking of Gilliam too, but I was thinking of the Imaginarium of
That's
Dr.
actually
Parnassus,
that's a better,
right? Where Ledger,
more apt description.
where
Yeah,
Ledger dies halfway through, and that's what I was thinking with Peter Sellers. I'm like, and I was thinking of that during this movie. Is like, couldn't there have been a way, instead of making just different Bonds, couldn't David Niven have put on like
yeah,
a
like a
mask,
Mission Impossible,
like a
scenario.
really good Q-made mask, exactly, and become Peter Sellers for a section of the movie where it was useful, pulled it back off when he didn't need it later, and
Yeah,
you
you probably still
following
need
one
Sellers for a
character.
little bit of that mask stuff, though.
Well, here's the thing, too.
I mean, they had extra things.
You think, like, let's go back. What if Sellers died instead of walked out? They probably would have handled it differently. I think there was probably some animosity to him leaving, where they said, well, we're definitely going to get our money's worth out of him.
Well, but
And that's what they said. They didn't want to work with him ever again.
Well, and also the difference with Parnassus is that Heath Ledger wasn't fighting Terry Gilliam every day.
No, that guy's just cursed.
Yeah, but leaving the set for, I mean, they said that Peter Sellers would be upset and just be gone for 2 or 3 days. So they were trying to shoot what they could, which is why the budget went so out of control.
Yeah.
It's
but
hard
again,
to find an example of something that's both so avoidable and so unavoidable at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, but I love like beach blanket movies, which are dopey as hell, but they're just funny and silly. And one thing you brought up about Hellzapoppin' was it was intent. Again, intent to me doesn't count. Hellzapoppin' is just a romp, and it's fun and it's silly, and it's not really a parody. It's Olsen and Johnson having fun, and basically it's an adaptation of their live stage performance.
Right.
So with Casino Royale, it's the same thing. It's just fun. It parodies a genre that was well known, and at the end of the day, yeah, it's bloated and long. But
and to speak to intent, like Hellzapoppin' is designed as anarchy. It is literally like somebody just like distilled absolute madness and then put it into 70 minutes of film. Whereas Casino Royale couldn't help but be that. Right. And I think that to have those two kinds of sides of the pole is incredibly kind of valuable, just looking at how film is put together.
I prefer Apes-a-Poppin' personally.
Well, it's interesting trying to sell a romp unless you do it for no money. It's impossible these days. They just, in fact, I've even with the Muppet stuff, I've pitched ideas and stories that were a lot more linear than Hellzapoppin', but essentially more like a Holy Grail to me is one of the best comedies because it's more about a subject than a plot. I mean, it's literally Monty Python and the Holy Grail. That is the premise. And there's entire scenes that have nothing to do with it, like Mandy and the huge tracts of land and all that. Just, it's just there and it's funny and you remember it and it really has nothing to do with the Holy Grail. But
it's more of an attitude than a film.
Right, or exactly. Or it's a premise or a genre. Again, it's sort of genre. It's a Knight's Grail movie, which isn't really probably a genre, medieval, King Arthur film. And
so, Kirk, you told me you tried a Muppet Bond spoof.
Yeah,
like a spy spoof at one point, like before Austin Powers.
Yeah, way before and Miss Piggy was Honey Bacon him. still makes me laugh. Whenever he calls her Honey Baked Ham, she's like, "It's Beckenham. It's pronounced Beckenham." And we couldn't sell it. Austin Powers came out, and I said that's the movie we should be making. And the head of film development at Henson at the time told me that she walked out on it. She couldn't stand it. And I'm like, well, there's the problem. Again, I like quirky, funny, offbeat stuff, and I don't know what she wanted to make. She ultimately didn't make any good movies while she was there. But she was poorly cast, if you will. It wasn't her strength, those kind of silly movies. And I have a huge love for silly films. Again, the Beach Blanket movies, the Asher, what's his name? Bob Asher, Bill Asher movies, just silly. And I like Ed Wood movies because they're just bad, but they were earnest. I guess the earnestness I love on those. He thought he was making a good film, and they stand the test of time. I mean, they've made musicals, they've made movies about the making of Plan 9. That's an interesting idea. If somebody made a movie about the making of, like you said, there's been kind of mini documentaries, in fact.
Yeah. Well, and Ed Wood, the film, Tim Burton's Ed Wood touches on it a bit too. I like Glenda because of its earnestness. I went to see Trace Beaulieu and Frank Conniff riff Glenda, and it hurt a little bit. Like, I just felt bad because I'm just like, oh, he means all of this so much, and to say those and do those things at that time was just, it was so brave, to say that, it was so brave, but it was really brave. And then I talked to Trace a bit after, and he was like, yeah, I hate riffing that movie because it's good to me. It's a good movie.
And there's something to be said about conviction.
Yeah, can't we say that's what Casino Royale was kind of lacking, though? It wasn't very earnest, and it wasn't very deliberate. They kind of stumbled into all of those things.
I was curious how the movie was sold. Like, did you know what you were getting into when you walked into the theaters?
No, because critics weren't allowed to screen it before, so there wasn't really been anyone
as like you've seen Sean Connery, now see these guys?
Well, I think
Orson Welles said everyone saw it because of the scandalous lady on the poster.
Yeah, but I also think poster. Peter Sellers, people weren't expecting to be, I think they were expecting to be a bit of a send-up because he wasn't known as a dramatic actor. So I think
so when it originally came out, Kirk, when did you see it for the first time?
I didn't see it when it first ran. I think I saw it as a kid watching TV, probably in the mid-'70s when I was like 10 or 12, and I just thought, it was, with commercials, it was probably 3 hours long. But,
you're lucky you weren't in Guatemala.
Exactly. And had you had experience with Bond films before it, or was this a different frame of reference?
No, my first Bond film, I think it was Goldfinger, that I saw in the drive-in with my family, and my dad loved Bond, so I saw every Bond movie. So by the time I saw Casino Royale, I'd probably had seen at least 5. I'd seen Dr. No, Goldfinger, Live and Let Die,
From Russia with Love,
Live and Let Die. I hadn't.
You Only Live Twice, Diamonds Are Forever. Those are the
I didn't see the
Connerys.
Lazenby version, and I'd seen at least 1 or 2 of the Roger Moores. So I knew the genre really well, and I thought, oh, that's hilarious. And, I knew the actors. I knew Orson Welles. I knew David Niven, Woody Allen, obviously. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was this crazy, fun movie that really was like, wow, movies can be, again, even before I was writing or making films, just the fact that you didn't know what was going to happen really appealed to me. It was just fun. That I enjoy that kind of adventure of like, this is, and it's very episodic. I mean, the Muppet movie, the first Muppet movie, everybody holds so dear. It's just very episodic. It's very, linear in that it's about a frog going to Hollywood, and the rest is all just kind of hung on that, with complete detours into silliness. And then the Mel Brooks movies that I probably should have brought up in defense, which again, parody genres. Again, you don't go for the plot. You don't go, wow, that story really paid off. It was just like Blazing Saddles or Young Frankenstein was pretty linear. Blazing Saddles was more a pastiche of a genre. Young Frankenstein really is just a Frankenstein movie. Yeah. But Blazing Saddles was a good example that I probably should have used, in that it just falls apart at the end. But you don't go, oh, that was a terrible movie. You go like, oh, it's funny, and it made fun of cowboy movies.
It's strange that, like, with Blazing Saddles, you can look at the ending and go, how audacious. To have the balls to absolutely not have your last 20 minutes make sense. And then you look at Casino Royale. How dare they have that movie not make sense?
But like that, yes. And that's what kills me. I love the endings where they die and go to heaven. And then you've got that cheesy, James Bond's fighting it, 1930s. Yeah. Made a lot of money, but a gal at Casino. It's just silly. And I'm like, well, come on. How else do you end that movie? Well, it's like Holy Grail ends the same way. The police come and arrest them. You're like, what? Wait.
I guess it started with M like blowing himself up, so yeah. I should have known from that moment that it's going to be that sort of disjointedness.
But also, it's funny too, as film tastes. This was 1967. It was the beginning of the end for big studio pictures. The Hello Dollies and the Cleopatras and all. And in the 1970s, movies with downer endings suddenly became the rage. All these darker films. There weren't comedies, but even Harold and Maude, just the zeitgeist was more like, oh, we don't have to have big, happy Hollywood endings. So this is a big ending that wasn't happy, but it was funny. So again,
yeah, this film actually was compared to Cleopatra. I think it was called like a mini Cleopatra because
So
it was
expensive,
so
yeah.
expensive.
And it's kind of like it is the exact moment of the collapse of the studio system. And you can actually look at this as kind of having the subtext of what the entire industry was going through, but like put into 130 minutes.
Well, somebody wrote a very, when I was looking just for references, if anyone had kind of deconstructed or taken apart Casino Royale, someone had written a very scholarly review of it as part of a review of every James Bond movie. So they it was on Google Books if anyone's interested. I think it's called Bond Examined or something, but they did a few pages on Casino Royale, and the defense of it was a postmodern. It was the beginning of postmodern deconstruction of Bond films, and I was like, wow. I mean, it's way too heady for me to bring up because I would have sounded like an a-hole, but it sort of touched on, and he brought up Hell's a Pop, all the stuff I had thought of independently. They brought up Hell's a Poppin' and later parody genre films. So I knew I was on the right track for at least what its strengths were. But I still, again, I will always love. I love it.
You can still enjoy a guilty movie here. That's the thing. It's
a guilty pleasure.
As you know, yeah, a lot of us are Misties, and we we like bad movies. We enjoy them for their campiness.
I like the Resident Evil movies. I'll admit they're terrible, but I like them.
Well,
you just like Mila Jovovich.
But part of the fun of those films, particularly the Misty stuff, is because they're so low budget and hampered by the production issues. Are like they just didn't have the money, or this definitely had the money.
Right.
And so you can't say, well, I like it because it's charming and it's in the paucity of budget. It's more like charming in the fact that they just threw, I mean, literally everything in the kitchen sink. I mean, that is the last 20 minutes. It's, by the time the Indians are dropping, seeing Geronimo and with parachutes shaped like teepees, you're just like, oh my God, that's the fun of it. You're kind of sitting there with the jaw open going, what else are they going to throw here? I mean, they had lions and
tigers and bears.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my.
It's like they just leaned over to the movie set next door and hey, you want to pop in here for a second?
Yeah, and that's
I liked the big fight in the end, more or less.
That's one of the things you remember. I think, as have not seen it for 20 years or something. What you remember is Orson Welles, the complete acid trip of where they're trying to break his mind with all the super psychedelic weirdness with the marching band, and you're just like, I don't know what's going on.
Right.
And Woody Allen, and it's the last half of the movie you remember. The first, probably the first 2/3. You're like, all right. I totally forgot.
If we had just skipped the first half hour of the McTarry stuff, it would have cut a whole half hour off. I would have gotten to Peter Sellers faster, and then I would have been a lot more entertained overall.
The whole McTarry women trying to seduce James Bond is just so. You just kind of watch it going, it's so goofy. And then to make one plot point is that James Bond is, not, he can't be seduced, or the original Bond. And it's a weird plot point to spend that much time on. But again, you're just, but I love goofy movies that sort of are what they are. Like, again, the Beach Blanket movies. There's a terrible Sam Arkoff film that I love called Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine, which is another James Bond parody. Where Vincent Price plays a parody of Goldfinger. He's Dr. Goldfoot. And because he wears gold shoes, like gold genie slippers. And he's built a machine that I think predates the girl bomb from Get Smart that creates android women who wear bikinis. And when they get close to heads of state, they blow up. So they seduce heads of state and then kill them. And it's got Frankie Avalon and Dwayne Hickman are the male leads. And it's got a couple gals from that era. And it's completely goofy, but just it's so dopey and fun and unapologetically that way that you got to love it. So, we can. And
what's your favorite line that Vincent Price says in that movie?
It's my machine, my bikini machine. And he delivers it just exactly that way. He doesn't do it super campy. He does it like he's this character, but He's kind of winking at the audience just in his delivery, but
Give that man an Oscar.
Okay, so that's going to be Kirk's recommendation of a movie for everyone to check out if you can find it. Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine.
Writing this down.
And we'll let Ben, I know you were our judge this week, so I'll let our judge also give a recommendation of a film he's watched recently that he thinks would be palatable and enjoyable.
Well, the movie I watched just before this, I had seen before, but it was in the theaters about a year ago, was Mirai. It's an anime. I'm weird. I like animes. It was directed by Hosoda, who did like Wolf Children and Boy and the Beast and things like that. It's a really good film about legacy that's like sort of played out with this little kid who's playing in his backyard in Imagination Land, but he's like going back in time and like meeting his grandfather and stuff. So it's a very, very interesting film. I'd recommend anyone who's interested in anime or wanting to dip their toes into something that's not like completely weird with giant robots. Check something like that out.
Is it one of those animes where the tentacles come and grab the girls?
There are no tentacles. It is
Okay.
certified
Taking it off
tentacle
the
free. I
list.
think they put a sticker on the box.
I've seen a few of those. So just
I have no doubt of that,
was,
Maynard.
It was Mirai. Okay. No tentacles, though, just so with that. And with that, I guess we'll wrap it up, and we'll see you all next time on Reels of Justice. So thanks for hanging out with us, Kirk.
Oh, thanks,
and we'll
guys.
see everybody next time.
This was fun. Take care.
And if you'd like to share your thoughts on this week's trial or the verdict, please email us at reelsofjusticepodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @reelsofjustice and on Instagram, reelsofjustice. Also, check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/reelsofjustice.